Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Donna Wares, editor of the LA Times Book Club. Our special guest today is Walter Isaacson, the best-selling journalist, author, and biographer. He's the former editor of Time magazine and has profiled some of history's greatest game changers: Steve Jobs, Leonardo da Vinci, Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, and biochemist Jennifer Doudna. For the past 2 years, Walter Isaacson has shadowed one of his most innovative and unpredictable subjects yet. His new book, Elon Musk, takes us inside the tech entrepreneur's violent childhood in South Africa, his escape to Canada, his college years at the University of Pennsylvania, and then his dramatic, tumultuous rise in Silicon Valley. Isaacson portrays a billionaire entrepreneur who lacks empathy for others and is obsessed with video games, computers, electric cars, rockets, getting to Mars, and with books too. Early on, we learned that young Elon was heavily influenced by The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the jaunty science fiction book by Douglas Adams about denizens of the galaxy building a supercomputer to figure out the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. Walter Isaacson says the novel helped shape Elon Musk's philosophy. It led, he says, to a lifelong fascination with the tantalizing thought that we might merely be pawns in a simulation devised by some higher order beings. But don't panic. Walter Isaacson is here to talk about what he's discovered in the world according to Musk. Today, he joins us for a conversation with my colleague, Times columnist Anita Chabrier. And now, please join me in welcoming Walter and Anita to the LA Times Book Club stage. What a pleasure to have you here.
Anita.
Walter, so amazing to have you with us. Thank you so much for being
here. And congratulations on your column.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And congratulations on what is the absolute book of the year.
Well,
as
the roller coaster ride of the year.
And it's not just a book. You've broken news. You've been on the front page so many times with all the wonderful reporting in that book. So.
Well, you should not confuse Boswell with Dr. Johnson. It's Elon that's a newsmaker. I'm just a chronicler.
Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of credit.
All right.
And on that note, I know everyone is here to talk about Elon, and thank you all for coming out for our first afternoon book event. We love seeing you here. But before we get to Elon, I want to talk about you.
Oh, well.
You are from New Orleans.
Definitely.
You were editor of Time. Mm-hmm. You were CEO of CNN. Mm-hmm. You were a lowly newspaper person like myself at one point. But before,
for the Times-Picayune, let's give them a shout out.
And then in London. But before all that, you were the protege of the Southern novelist Walker Percy.
Wow.
And
how do you know that?
I can Google.
Oh, okay.
And he had
Is there anybody here who knows who Walker Percy is? Yeah, there are a few hands. Okay, the novelist of The Moviegoer in the 1960s and 70s from Louisiana.
Yes, a very famous novelist.
Yeah.
And he had something called The Search. And I'm wondering if you can start off and tell us what Walker Percy's search compares to Elon's mission and how that played into your reporting.
That's a really good question. And one of the things that Walter Percy says in The Moviegoer and then Last Gentleman and others is that people feel their worst when things are going well. And the malaise, he calls it, comes in. And it's true, having been there, that in New Orleans, where he's from too, people feel their best when a hurricane is coming. There is something about that energizes you, electrifies the air, and you know what you should do. And that was a clue that Percy had on what is it that makes bad times in some ways more energizing. And The Search was his more spiritual way to look for it. Musk is very much that way, which is when things are going very well, he is unnerved and almost a pain to be around. In fact, when I started, a few months after I started reporting this book, was it end of 2021, he had just become Person of the Year. He had just, by the Financial Times and Time, just become the richest person on the planet. Had taken Tesla, which was basically out of money and going down the tubes, and made it more valuable than the next 9 car companies combined, and sold 1 million cars. He had been the only person to be able to shoot off rockets and send people to orbit. Boeing couldn't do it, NASA couldn't get Americans from the US to the space station, and then re-land the rockets and reuse them. And I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be an inspiring book. This is going well. And he said, no, I can't. I have to keep putting my chips back on the table. Almost, I need the storm. I need the drama. And I said, yeah, okay. And his brother Kimball says he's a drama magnet. He's going to go nuts right now because things are going well. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, I'm buying Twitter. And I go, oh, God, okay, this is not a good thing. But that, I'm sorry to go on a bit, but it ties in with Walker Percy's notion that you have to get out of yourself and be something larger. The difference, this is the first time, I mean, man, I've been asked so many questions like, about this, and this is the first time anybody's asked something like this, so I'm formulating it. But Walker Percy's search was spiritual. He ends up, as you know, on a journey that leads him to make what he calls the leap of faith at the end of The Moviegoer, Kierkegaard-like, and he becomes a practicing Roman Catholic, but there are other ways to become very spiritual. Musk's missions are threefold, and we get into them later if you want, but they start in childhood, and they're almost epic superhero missions mixed a little bit too much with Captain Underpants, if you know what I mean. He sees himself as this epic figure that's going to save the planet. And you think, okay, that's nuts, or it's just his pontificating for podcasts and pep talks. But then you realize, oh my goodness, this guy really is on these missions. And that's his way of overcoming what Walker Percy would have called the malaise. The malaise is just the everydayness of things. When you wake up and say, what is this about? Why am I here? What is the meaning of it all? And we all, doubt there's anybody in this room who hasn't felt the malaise and sort of, in a more technical way, an existential sense of not understanding one's being. And people react to it in different ways. Some people throw themselves into serving the people around them. For Walker Percy, it becomes a spiritual leap of faith. And for Musk, it becomes, I must have drama and put all my chips back on the table in this quest to save humanity, which I don't mean to make that sound like he's just this most noble person. He's halfway between noble and nuts half the time.
And this book is largely chronological. You start with his childhood in South Africa,
Yeah.
but more so where you drop the needle is on his father and the demons of his father. At what point in the reporting did you realize that that was going to be the case? And did Elon understand that this was a book with his father as an emotional center?
Elon would talk to me about everything, except when it was about his father. And his eyes would tear up and he'd go silent for a very long time. If you've read previous books, including Ashley Vance or this great Rolling Stone profile that was on him by Neil Strauss, they say, and yet when you ask him about the childhood, he just goes blank. The good thing about riding alongside with him for 2 years is I learned that you can push a door and it won't open, you can push a door and it won't open, but you got a lot of time and you keep pushing. And at some point it'll be really late at night on a plane, or and you push one more time. Second thing I learned, and I learned this on the Times-Picayune when I was a kid, which is don't fill the silences. If you're with somebody and they don't want to talk about something, you just outlast them. It may take 3, 4, 5 minutes, which, as you know, is a really long time, but you outlast them. So I kept asking about the childhood. Now, one secret of biographers is that there is always rosebud. You know, there's something in childhood that helps, doesn't explain everything, but it helps explain things. And often for a successful man, it's the relationship with the father. You know, Barack Obama's opening paragraph. I think every successful man is either trying to live up to the expectations of his father or live down the sins of his father, and in my case, it's both. Nixon, probably a little bit less self-aware but more pithy, just begins by saying, I was born in a house my father built. Start the first paragraph of Clinton, it's him trying to figure out his father. Steve Jobs, he's got two fathers in a way, because he his birth father and then his adoptive father, and he's wrestling with both. And even Leonardo da Vinci, born out of wedlock, his father refuses to legitimate him, which back then you can, you know, make somebody the legitimate kid, refuses to. Leonardo's a misfit. He's left-handed, he's gay, he's in this little village, and he finally moves from Vinci to Florence. But those demons still swirl. So the question is how demons of childhood swirl in your head and explain, not excuse, but explain some of the darkness, but also the drives. And all of us with our demons, and I think for better or worse, mine are a little bit less than most people. Because growing up in New Orleans, you know, I mean, it's like, no, nothing's demonic there. But, you know, that's why I don't send rockets into orbit. I write about people who are in the arena. I'm not in the arena myself. But how you harness those drives is important. And I'll just give you one scene that I think is dealing with the father. Musk is socially awkward. He's scrawny. He says he has Asperger's, and he has no good ability to understand incoming emotional signals or to try to make people in front of him like him. So what happens in school? Yeah, he gets beaten up badly, often. And at one point, he gets pushed down the concrete steps. His brother Kimball is there. He says, by the end, they've pummeled his face so much that I couldn't recognize him. And he's in the hospital for almost a week. Those scars still exist. He still has, you know, things he has to, operations he has to do. But those are minor compared to what happens when he goes home and his father makes him stand there for more than an hour in front of him, rigid, not saying a word, while the father berates him, tells him he's stupid, tells him it's his fault, and takes the side of the kid who beat him up and says you'll never amount to anything. So these are the reasons that you have drives and demons that all people have, but they're at least 2 orders of magnitude higher than most of us. And you mentioned, I didn't see much of it, but that Elon Musk, the father, was commenting on the book. And I noticed at least in the 2 or 3 times he's never denied that story. So he just says, oh, it's all rubbish. But he does say, yeah, I treated him harshly in an authoritative way, and he does that now to others. So it's a complex thing.
It is extremely complex, and you go into it quite detailed. Do you believe that Elon has some form of autism?
Yeah, I think that he's on the autism spectrum disorder, and he uses a somewhat common phrase, Asperger's, which I know is not the technical term now often used. And he understands well that, and he has a son. I mean, it's easy for him to understand because he has a son, Saxon, who's the sweetest, wisest kid, but is autistic to the extent that he needs a minder at all times to walk around. I think most of us know, you and I were talking about it. I certainly in my family, and you know people who have Asperger's in different ways and different forms. But there's a common theme, especially when it comes to Musk, which is you do not receive emotional signals from the people around you very well, and you don't sit there trying hard to send in emotional signals and to be empathetic. Kimball, his brother, who knows him incredibly well, says, I'm the one who got the empathy gene. Elon didn't, and he can run an enterprise very well, partly because he doesn't feel that much about the people who happen to be in the room. And the problem, especially when people are making assessments of Musk, is if you lack the empathy gene, and I'm not sure I've written about genetic editing, I'm not sure there's one gene, but let's use that in a colloquial sense. We have a lot of common terms for that, including jerk, and even one that begins with an A that's more, sharp. And so we don't cut people, we'll cut them some slack if they're manic or depressive or other things. But if they're of this emotional stuntedness, it's very problematic.
I find it so interesting, and we'll go into his family life and things like that, but one of the great criticisms of the book has been that you sort of gave him a pass on this demon mode or on his bad behavior. But viewing it through the lens of autism sort of changes that. Do you
Yes
think
and no, I don't think you get a pass. I mean, look, you've told me the story, I don't know if you want to, but about, somebody in your family, not your children, but somebody in your family with autism. And it's hard to know. I think it's combined with things. I won't name names here, but somebody I'm on a TV show with sometimes, and many other people said, oh man, I've got a kid who's autistic or a kid who has Asperger's. And one of these people said to me, and I take him to baseball games, and just all the time, I've got my arm around him, and all the time I'm saying to him, when the man hands you the popcorn, say thank you. Look him in the eye. With somebody, don't give an honest answer. I mean, I had to say that to my daughter, who is a little bit this way. It's like she always gave, somebody would say, what do you think of my dress? And she'd say, it's ugly. And you'd say, wait, and, but I shouldn't trivialize it. I mean, sometimes when somebody has Asperger's, it takes somebody with an arm around at all times, and it really doesn't hold that much, as you said, but at least people can say, no, don't say that to that person. Musk not only had has Asperger's, but he had a father who did just the opposite of that, and a mother who's a great person but was sort of distant. And so it's more than just having Asperger's, it's having this complex childhood, and it's also his fault. At a certain point, you should just learn you've got these demons or handicaps, but overcome them. If you read the book, and I'm quite happy and believing in the criticism, I gave him a pass because he has Asperger's, because he has demons from childhood. I don't know that I was trying to justify it, but there's a fine line between explaining a person and justifying what they do. And at the end of the book, I say, man, no, it's not justified to have done all these things this badly. But my job is not just to preach at you. To go back to Walter Percy, when I finally read one of his novels, because I was like 12 years old, I never knew what, I said to his daughter, Ann, what does your dad do? He's always sitting on the dock drinking bourbon, and eating hog-head cheese. He said, well, he's a writer. And I finally read The Moviegoer, I was about 12. And I said, Uncle Walker, there's a whole lot of lessons you're trying to teach in this narrative. And he said there are two types of people who come out of Louisiana, preachers and storytellers. He said, for heaven's sake, be a storyteller. This world has too many preachers. And nowadays, that's particularly true. Everybody wants your hot take. Everybody wants you to demonize or canonize somebody or slam them as evil or say they're a genius. I think if I tell you the story, you can say, all right, as so many people in the book, I get that this guy has been able to do all of this, and to some extent, he might not have been able to achieve it had he not been this way, but that still doesn't justify it. I wouldn't want to be that way. And so I'll cop a plea to try to understand the narrative, and if people say, that's really bad because you're giving him a pass, I go, read the book carefully. He ain't got a pass in this book.
You bring up another point, though, because you were around him 24/7 for 2 years. You were at his beck and call. He'd text at night. What was that like? What was it like to be in his orbit?
I'm going to do, after I did Kissinger, I decided, I'm going to do somebody who's been dead for 200 years. I did Ben Franklin. And after I did Steve Jobs, who, by the way, had some let's say, intensity similarities. I said, okay, 500 years. I did Leonardo. I think after being around him, I'm going to, Plato and Aristotle are on there. The interesting thing about being around him at all times is, like his father, he's a Jekyll and Hyde. He can switch personalities on an instant almost. You go from very light and giddy and funny to being very dark and back, and hardly remember what Mr. Hyde did when he's back to being Dr. Jekyll. In fact, he has multiple personalities. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't diagnose even autism or Asperger's, but he's close to having one of these multiple personality types. And there were times it was almost inspiring and exciting to be with him. Late at night, walking the assembly line for the Starship rocket and the Raptor engines, that is the biggest movable object ever made. And I've been to Boeing and others, they can't even get test flights up, and this guy is 2, 3 in the morning, still pushing people to do things. There were times when he was charming and funny and, almost sophomoric funny, not my sense of humor, but we'd be watching Monty Python skits on his phone of the School of Silly Walks, if anybody's old enough to remember the old Monty Python skits, while he was doing Optimus the Robot, this big thing he's doing that's going to be huge and people haven't paid much attention to. But there were times when he was dark and cold and mean to people, and that just totally put me off. I'm not only not a tough person like that, that's one of my flaws, which is why I was not particularly good at running CNN, is that I care very much to make everybody around me happy. I want everybody to like me, which seems like a sweet trait until you're running an enterprise that needs disruption.
That is true, but I think you probably did okay at CNN. It was a tough time during 9/11.
Yes.
But I also want to go back. You did a biography of Henry Kissinger that came out in 1992. And I read a story at that time, and I'll let you tell it, about thinking you were invited to his Thanksgiving.
Oh, yeah. All right. When you're a biographer, you try to keep, other than with Jennifer Doudna, who I did become friends with because she's just so wonderful, you try to keep an objective distance. And with Kissinger, it was not like doing Musk or even Steve Jobs, because Kissinger was just, he gave me 15 interviews, and I interviewed other people, but it wasn't like by your side at all times, the way I was somewhat with Steve Jobs and then with Musk. And so one Thanksgiving, I'm somewhat surprised. I'm sitting in my office at Time magazine, and I get a call from his assistant, who I knew, and said, Dr. Kissinger wants to invite you and your wife to Thanksgiving with them up in Connecticut. I'm going, huh? Because I hadn't turned in the book yet, and I'm thinking, well, this is inappropriate. But so I'm very careful. I said, gee, my wife's family is around. I so appreciate it, but I think I just can't possibly do it, even though it's sweet. I get a call back about 5 minutes later, and she's crying. I feel so bad for her because I knew her well. And she says, Dr. Kissinger insisted I call you back because he doesn't want you to misunderstand something. I said, what's that? She said, he told me to invite Isaac Stern for Thanksgiving, and I thought he said Isaac's son, and now he wants you to know you weren't invited. Go figure.
It's a great story, but I also bring it up for the challenges of being a biographer and not crossing boundaries. So back in the day with Kissinger, you seem to have these very straightforward boundaries. You were not going to fraternize. How does that sync up with Elon and this 2-year journey?
As I said, with Steve Jobs, it wasn't that much of a problem. I spent a whole lot of time with him, and I did spend time with his family at his home. But I didn't have that strong of a boundary. With Jennifer Doudna, I didn't either. And if any of you have read that book, The Code Breaker, people sometimes ask, do you have to be a jerk in order to get things done? I say, read the book about Jennifer Doudna, because she is as nice as you get. So I didn't feel wary. With Musk, he is such a strong, controversial, sometimes bad, sometimes amazing personality and somebody who doesn't have very good emotional receptors, that I felt I had to really draw a line that I was not his friend. I was not his pal. I was his biographer. And sometimes I'd do things in the evenings with him, but I was very careful. It's like, okay, we're going to dinner, but Mark Juncosa from SpaceX is coming, and Gwen Shotwell, and your mother and your son is not just a party. But then they'd go off maybe doing something social afterwards, and I wouldn't go. So I tried to draw that line, which is I didn't try to become his friend, his pal, and I did not go to Burning Man or to parties with him. And I watched some people, even some, I don't know if they're in the audience, but people who live here in Los Angeles, and Hawthorne is, you can almost walk to the SpaceX facility here. And sometimes they would cross the line and think they were his pal and start going out to parties with him, and it just wasn't a good idea.
Why not?
I think with Musk, I had to draw some boundaries so that I tried to be objective. So all the bad stories are in too. I know, as you said, some reviewers say I gave him too much of a pass, but there are more bad stories in there, starting with the father, but all the way through the things he does. And if you become too much of a pal, you sugarcoat things. And also, he's a character who can turn on you. He does go into these demon modes. He does go into flamethrower mode. And I tried to stay in the corner at all times. You'll see some pictures of me, only because people would be taking pictures, whether it be at Twitter when he first did it, or SpaceX. You generally, although I saw one on the screen of me leaning forward talking to him in the SpaceX control room, but if you see the rest of the time, I'm in the corner because I'm trying to be the observer.
You know, in the book you write that his son X is often with him, and X I think is 2 or 3. He's
Just hit 3, I think.
You just hit
actually, 3 and 4 months, yeah.
And you write a bit about Vivian Jenna, who is his transgender daughter, and his estrangement from her. But you don't touch a lot on the other kids. What kind of dad is he? How much time does he spend with his family?
What type of father is he? Yeah. First of all, he's a very needy father. And this, actually, people say, well, that's contradictory. You said he has Asperger's, he's not emotionally needy. He wants his children around him at all times. He wants, if I talk about Griffin in the book quite a bit, and Griffin's at the Starship launch. There's a picture I took of them together. And X is with him all the time. And he says, nothing pains me more than when one of my kids, and they're triplets, his older kids are triplets and twins, so they're, I think, around 16 and 18 now, let me guess. And, you know, man, when I was 17, I wasn't like, hey, Dad, let's hang out together. And so he does, but he does, and they're all special, and there are many meanings of the word special, but they're, you know, one's a total math prodigy who composes dark Bach music. You know, they're all sort of geniuses with the things that come with that. Do you want me to go into Jenna too?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's
so
the next question.
There was his first child dies in infancy. And so then he has 5 children, the oldest of which, sort of, I mean, because it's a twin, but oldest, Musk names Xavier, because he loves the letter X, his favorite person from the X-Men comics. And this is in the book. Let me go back and answer some of the other. The younger children, the younger teenagers, especially the 15-year-olds, I talked to Griffin, I talked to Kai. As I say, Saxon's autistic, and I had permission to use it. I talked to their mothers. I made a bit of a mistake in the Steve Jobs book. I put a little bit too much about his 3 kids, especially the 2 younger ones, especially the middle daughter, who was then 15 or 14 and got kind of hurt because of some of the things. And my wife berated me and said, you always got to figure out when it's a kid who's an innocent, bystanding kid under the age of 18, if you don't have their permission, be really careful. the only things you should put in are things that are absolutely needed for the reader, and you have to balance that for how hurtful will that be for when the kid grows up. So I did talk to Griff, and he said, fine, put me in. But he mentioned two of his younger brothers who just cringe at having their privacy violated. So I was a little respectful of them. I talk about them in the book, but not by name.
No, that's
Yeah.
fascinating context that you.
And
that
it was
in.
something I changed. I made a mistake on the Jobs book of maybe putting too much in. So then we get to Jenna. So Xavier, at age 16, about 3 years ago, sends a text message to to her aunt, I'll say, hi, I'm transitioning, and my name is Jenna. She actually legally changes it to Vivian Jenna Wilson because she doesn't want to have anything to do with her father, doesn't want to have his last name. She calls herself Jenna, but you'll read it in the papers as Vivian because that's the way she legally changed it. And I do have to put that in because it is very relevant to some of the political changes that happened to Musk, some of the sadness that happens to Musk, and he gets his head around well enough the transitioning. What he doesn't get his head around is that she will never speak to him, that she's changed the name because she's become very progressive, left-wing, calls herself socialist or Marxist, hates capitalism, hates billionaires, thinks that rich people, et cetera. And he blames it, for those of you living here, he said that's the ideology that got ingrained in her at Crossroads, which is the Los Angeles progressive school she was at. I'm not making any, as I get criticized for not making any judgments. I'm not making any judgments on Crossroads or anything like that. I just know that Musk says, I had my daughter taken away from me by all of these things, and she won't speak to me now. So that's all in the book.
Did you drill down, because he's very vocal about what he calls the woke mind virus, did you drill down with him at all on what that means?
Yeah, I mean, everybody, you say the word woke, which is a word I think we should probably relegate to the dustbin of history, or ban. No, we don't censor things. We just relegate it to the dustbin. Because everybody means something different, and I'm old enough to remember when everybody was talking about political correctness, which was a precursor to it. And I always thought, yeah, political correctness, that's not the worst thing in the world. It means being polite to people and using the pronouns they want or not saying anything that could, unnecessarily offend them. And there were people I worked with at Time Magazine who thought political correctness was the worst thing ever happening to America. So I've gone through this before. I think the same is true of wokeness. I think, you can define wokeness as being aware of people's sensitivities, of the discriminations that exist, and of trying to be polite to people. And you can also describe it as censoring things and being so progressive that you don't tell the truth about things. Musk believes the latter, as that word has, I won't say been hijacked, but it's been captured by the right as a way of saying you have to adhere to the ideologies of progressive ideologies or you're canceled or whatever it may be. It is, I'll go back to what I don't care, I guess most people don't care what I personally feel, but I personally feel this is one of the dumbest, we got a lot of problems in this country, and the woke mind virus, I can see in some cases it upset some people, but definitely it upset Musk.
And then he does what only a billionaire can do, and he buys Twitter.
And there's many reasons he does so. And I guess you're putting the finger on this being one of them.
I'm asking. Well, you were there, right?
Yeah, first of all, he's impulsive. So let's just start with the fact that, as I said, everything's going well for him. I'm thinking I've got a book that maybe a guy is a little strong cup of coffee for people, but he's still mainly a rocket and battery and electric car dude. And then he decides to put all his chips back on the table and do Twitter. One reason was he had a lot of money in his pocket, partly because he was reacting to progressive attacks on him, including his daughter, but say Elizabeth Warren, for example, saying he's dodging his taxes. Well, it's because, his money was still in the stock. He exercises stock options that are expiring, and he ends up paying more taxes than anybody in history has ever paid to any entity. And so he gets furious that he's being attacked by his daughter and other people for not paying taxes. But it still leaves him with $10 billion. I mean, I've exercised options and I don't have this problem. But he's got this money burning a hole in his pocket. And he says, what product do I like? Well, I love Twitter, and I think they're not improving the product enough, and I'm going to just start buying shares of Twitter, because I should not leave the money in the bank. I should invest in a product I believe in. Secondly, is this woke mind virus stuff. He says, okay, they're censoring. He had also been pushed to the right by the fact that he thought the lockdowns were too onerous and that people went overboard, something also you can argue about. But more importantly, he felt that Twitter had censored even the Barrington Declaration and others who said that school closures and lockdowns of factories will do more harm than good. You can argue that one way or the other, but Twitter had basically said, no, you're not allowed to argue that, and that was considered misinformation. So he's mad about that. He also just does this on an impulse. I mean, I'm there that day. He's talking about buying the stock, and we're in Austin. He flies to Hawaii to go to Larry Ellison's house and to meet with Natasha Bassett, I think her name is, right?
Did you go to Hawaii with him?
Huh? No, I did not go on that trip, but he then went to Vancouver, and I caught up with him. But while he's there, I have all of his text messages because he gives me all this stuff. He decides to stay up 3 nights in a row and to tell the Twitter management, I'm not going to take a board seat. Y'all are screwing this up. I'm going to go hostile, maybe. Then he flies to Vancouver, where Grimes, the mother of 3 of his children, Claire Boucher, including X, is there to meet X's grandparents for the first time. And Musk gets there. Elden Ring has come out. He has it on his phone. Anybody here? No, there's no
It's not the Elden
gamers,
Ring crowd.
but it's a hardcore game that you go through the many levels of the game. 5:30 in the morning, he and Grimes are staying up playing Elden Ring. At 5:35, he sends out the message, I made an offer. So this is more impulsive than I'm calculating this because of the woke mind virus are doing. And then finally, just to go on a bit, he had started 22 years earlier a company called X.com. And it was a payments platform, and it was something he really believed in. He thought it was going to be a payments platform that would be a social media network. It would be like WeChat. It would allow people to post their videos, their movies, their songs, their art, their journalism, and be paid, and it would be sort of this everything app. And then Peter Thiel forces them out, and they call it PayPal and get rid of the name X.com. And he said, ever since then, I've wanted to fulfill that vision, and I realized Twitter could be my accelerant to create X.com.
So he ultimately sees it as a business venture for a payment platform, but he has dove off the deep end into a cesspool of hate speech and misinformation.
Yeah. First of all, he says to me, I said, why? I try not to ever, be a player in the game. But sometimes I ask questions that, as my daughter would say, are too Socratic by half. And it was like, why the hell are you buying this? Type question. And he said, well, it's a technology problem. They just don't have all the features they need. They never do anything. They don't innovate. And I say to myself, not to him, but I say it in the book, no, Twitter is not a technology platform. It's an advertising medium that gathers eyeballs in a non-toxic environment so that Frito-Lay and Chevy can advertise their wares. And he doesn't get that. He doesn't have that emotional feel for making a beautiful site. And he's dedicated to having more free speech, as I said, which means bringing back Donald Trump, but also, I shouldn't say, in addition or also toxic really toxic, right-wingers or I think people, in my mind, who are racist or anti-Semitic. And so those things are floating around. But you said backstage something that's still interesting to me, which is it's a toxic environment in many places. If you don't follow any of these people, the only way you get them on the algorithm is if you keep clicking on them, and then it feeds them up to you. And the Twitter, before he bought it, was filled with bots, including Russian bots. And so when people say he's made Twitter, he's destroyed the sweet, wonderful playground that Twitter used to be, where nice people like us were anointed with blue check marks and had polite conversations. And then you said, and I would say, was there really ever such a Twitter? I mean, it did screw up the 2016, the 2020 elections. It was filled with bots, Facebook more so. So I think Twitter is a mess, especially since it does have some of this toxic stuff. Is it worse than it was 4 years ago? I've seen studies on both sides. I do know that if you're not clicking on these people, they're not thrust upon you, but if you are, they are. If I were running Twitter, I wouldn't have all these people on. And here's the mistake I think he makes, which is maybe you should allow more free speech, but he personally amplifies it. He will hit the like button on something like ban the ADL. He will hit the like button on, or say wow, or interesting, or retweet, or repost past few weeks, and I'm no longer covering them, so I'm only see it peripherally. Anything to do with migrants on the southern border. He's like, oh, wow, this is horrible, this is horrible. So when he does that, it amplifies some of this, what you call toxic, and which I do find discomforting stuff. Which, by the way, makes advertisers not want to be there. He blames a lot of people, including the ADL, because the ADL said pause advertising, and a lot of other people did too, and he's been just as harsh on all these other people, tried to say you're not allowed to tell people not to advertise, although ADL is still on, it's still, they're still on. But the reason Twitter is doing badly or doing worse financially is not because it's lost users. There are actually more users right now, monetizable monthly users of Twitter. It's because advertisers, a lot of them have pulled out because they don't want to be in a controversial environment.
Which brings me to a lightning round that I'm going to call, how worried should we be?
Okay, very.
How worried should we be that Twitter will derail our next election?
We should all be worried that social media has, in my mind, now done more harm than good. And I won't say a pioneer, but I created Pathfinder. When I was young at time, we helped create different social media outlets. I thought it was going to unite the world. I thought we were all going to be connected. I always thought it was far, far doing more benefit than harm. I now think it's doing more harm, especially to democracy. I think that's true of Reddit and Facebook and WeChat and Twitter and X. I think that there is more control now over bots, which were one of the big problems in the previous two elections. A lot of the bots being controlled out of St. Petersburg by the Russian Internet Research Agency. And by making people validate or verify themselves, he has done a good job at reducing the number of bots. On the other side, and with Musk, there's always another side, he's allowed some of these, and I don't know much about what Andrew Tate or Nick Fuentes, I read about them, but I assume what I read is partly true, that
Nothing
these are
good.
deplorable, these are, shouldn't use that word, Hillary has already used it, but these are not nice people.
Absolutely, and they are proliferating. I'm going to jump to Ukraine and Starlink together. Sure. You detail in your book, and it's been in the news now, how a decision that Musk made at one point, it was a little controversial, changed sort of the direction of that war, or limited it. But Starlink, which is the satellite system that Elon Musk has in space, that is a communications system, becoming very quickly one of the most powerful and viable communication systems on the globe controlled by one man. How worried should we be that Elon Musk holds
I'm
this
sorry
power?
I'm not making this a lightning round, because that's an important question. When the Russians invade Ukraine in March, let's say, maybe it was early April, all their communications, the Ukrainian military communications with their troops, knocked out that night. Why? Because Viasat, the commercial satellite they use, Russians' denial of service. Military satellites, U.S. satellites, all knocked out. One set of communication satellites withstands the Russian attack, and that's Starlink. He sent almost 5,000 up. They have yet to be destroyed by the Russians. So step one is, one way he got into this position is how come NASA and the Defense Intelligence and Viasat and others and can't make satellites that work as well. So he gets sent messages by the Ukrainians, including Vice Minister Fedorov, Mikhail Fedorov, as well as Zelensky. You got to save us, you got to save us. Because Ukraine would have been crushed within 4 or 5 days if they had had no communications amongst their troops. I mean, you just can't win a trench war that way. He sends the first night a few hundred, and then you see in the book, there's all he gave me, and I got from others, all the text messages to the Ukrainians, to his staff, to the people running Starlink for him. Rush these over, send them battery packs, send them through Poland. We are going to get them as much. So in some ways, he helped save Ukraine. And he does it not out of some grand geopolitical thing, but once again, it's almost, forgive this, but it's almost Captain Underpants playing epic hero. I can help save this. This is an important thing. So he does it. Fast forward to September. I'd spent a week with him and just gotten back home to New Orleans. And I was at my old high school watching my high school play football. Partly, only a few people will catch this, but there was a young senior named Arch Manning who had become the best prep football player. And I wanted to see his game. Phone rings, it's Musk, and he's telling me they are trying to use, the Ukrainians, trying to use Starlink to launch a sneak Pearl Harbor-like attack on the Russian fleet in Crimea. And he says, and I've talked to my engineers, and we're not allowing it. We're not going to allow it. I make a mistake, and I want to be very upfront. I interpret that to mean I am shutting it off. In fact, there's a complex geofencing for all satellites, including in the Donbass, which is a movable geofence, and within 100 kilometers of the Crimean coast that had been in place, not all of them in the Donbass, but that one. And so that night, his decision with his engineers was not to enable it. The Ukrainians did not know of the geofence because it's secret. So they had launched the subs, and they realized the subs are suddenly losing connectivity when they get to, and he's getting these text messages frantically from Fedorov and others, all in the book saying, hey, you've got to enable it. And he decides, no, I'm not going to enable it, which is the way I should have said it, and it does say now. That doesn't change the essence of the story or the essence of your question, which is, how does this guy have so much power in the middle of a Friday night to decide whether a Ukrainian attack should be allowed or not allowed on the Russian fleet? And I'm going, what do you, explain this to me. He says, well, the Russians will consider that an attack on the homeland, and their doctrine says they can respond with tactical nuclear weapons. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe so, but should you be making... And once again, I don't interfere, but I say, semi-Socratically, have you talked to General Mark Milley, as the chair of the Joint? Have you talked to Jake Sullivan, others in the administration? Because if I were in that position, I would say, I shouldn't be making this decision. Our experts should. And he does talk to them. And he talks to them quite a bit. And even he realizes he has too much power. Even though it was gained by the fact that somehow or another nobody else can get satellites to work, he then decides to contract a large number of satellites and services and dishes to the U.S. military and to the intelligence agencies so that the U.S. government and military gets to determine how they can be used. And he even created something called Starshield, which is a military version of Starlink that's now being sold to the U.S. government. And he says, these decisions should not be in my hands. It should be in the government hands, which is obviously, to me, the correct answer. But it takes a while to get there.
But also, I'll play devil's advocate, he still controls the rest of the satellites and can turn them on and off at will. So
Correct.
there's thousands of places around the globe where he could still have that kind of influence if a
Correct.
situation came up.
Which one you
If
say?
a situation came up.
Yes. And I know, and I said he let me in on almost everything, every morning, noon, and night. The the 3 or 4 times he said, you have to leave the room now, is when he had classified briefings on communication satellites or with, I assume, I don't know who, but I assume General Milley or the Defense Intelligence Agency. I assume he is consulting more with the U.S. government, and he says that if the U.S. government makes a request of me, if they had made a request on Crimea, I am a patriot, and I would do what they direct or request me. Now, you say, is he telling the truth? We'll find out. But, I hope we won't find out. But we do know that Starlink is now being used in Ukraine, and there have been attacks in Crimea, as you know. And I don't know if Starlink was used for those, but I know that that's now a decision that he's not making. If you're referring to other places, I don't know where, but I think he will consult with the U.S. government.
We are running out of time, and we have not touched on so many subjects.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's been wonderful. There's so many things with him to talk about. But
I'm really bad at lightning round.
well, maybe before we go to audience questions, I'll ask you this. I believe it was Tallulah, his second wife, said to you that her job is to keep him from going king crazy, which is a phrase that you said you liked.
I
Explain
love that phrase, king crazy, because when you get too powerful, it not only goes to your head, especially if you have an epic superhero Captain Underpants issue, you need somebody to say, calm down, get a hold of yourself. It's a very ancient thing. It used to be called, what was it, memento mori? The person who would walk behind the emperor in Rome, say, remember you're going to die. And it was supposed to keep you grounded.
Do you think anyone can keep Elon from going king crazy?
I think one person could have, and that was Tallulah. I love Tallulah. I don't know if any of you have seen, she plays the boring middle daughter in Pride and Prejudice. I went over to England to see her. If Elon would only, and they married, got divorced, and then got married again. And she even came and visited a year ago, because she loves the teenagers, and went to SpaceX. And yeah, she would be great if she came. There are many things you want to do with Musk once you finish writing the book, and you say, if I could only, one would be take away his Twitter feed, take away Twitter from him, and thirdly, get him married to Tallulah, who would walk by his side and say, don't become king crazy. But, as I say at the end of the book, and this is a complex thing, it'd be great if you could restrain Musk, if he had an impulse control button, if you could say, don't do that. The question becomes, would a restrained Musk accomplish as much as a Musk unbound? Or is this all part of a whole cloth where the crazed impetuousness fulfills the Steve Jobs phrase that the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do?
And with that, I will allow Donna to come back with some questions from our audience.
Well, before we go to reader questions, I just want to say to both of you, and I hope the audience will join me, thank you so much.
Thank you.
What a
And
conversation.
Anita, you've been a really good interviewer.
Thank you, Anita. Anita is a Times columnist. As I mentioned, she writes about California and is just one of our really rising stars who's just amazing. So I would suggest you all continue to read her. And what a great, you two are wonderful together. So thank you. We had so many questions from readers, and Anita touched on quite a few of the topics, but I want to share a few more. It's nice is that we had, the outpouring on this one, everyone was curious about so many things. So that tells me we picked a really good book for us to all be talking about, and a really great author. So thank you both. So this question comes from Chris Coleridge, and he says, who would you prefer to be stuck on a desert island with? Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Leonardo da Vinci, or Henry Kissinger? And I'm going to add a little caveat to that, and I'm going to say, tell us why.
Yeah, Leonardo. What an awesome character. And Steve Jobs told me I had to write about Leonardo. And I said, why? He said, because all your books are about the connection of the humanities to the sciences and how that's where creativity occurs. I didn't realize that until he told me. And he said, you got to do Leonardo because he's the ultimate. Leonardo is the person in history who tried to know everything you could possibly know about everything that was then knowable. And so even though he too had demons, and from the very first turmoil of the water going past the ankles of Christ and the baptism of Christ to his very last deathbed drawings of the deluge swirls, you see the demons, but you also say this is I won't get in trouble, one of the top 5 interesting minds in history.
Thank you.
I can't figure out who the other 4 are. But,
Okay, so our next question comes from Kristen Hoover. And she wants to know, what character traits interest you most when you choose a person to write a biography?
Creativity. I knew a lot of smart people when I was at Time Magazine and other places. And what always puzzled me is that smart people don't usually amount to much. They're a dime a dozen, but it's the creative people, the imaginative people, the ones who think different, as Jobs said. And so what is the ingredient that makes you creative and to some extent a disruptor? And that gets to a question we talked about a little, is do you have to be a little bit of a jerk to be a disruptor? And no, Ben Franklin wasn't that way, and Jennifer Doudna wasn't that way. But generally, the character traits are being creative, and to me, an element of creativity is thinking different, thinking out of the box, and being disruptive.
Great, thank you so much. This next question, what do you drive? And would you consider a Tesla?
Yes, of course. I drive a Tesla in New York. We live in New Orleans, but we have a little apartment in New York, and we have our daughter there. So when I say we have a Tesla, she mainly uses it, but somehow I paid for half of it, so I can show you exactly where it is by hitting the little Tesla app, and it pops up. And in New Orleans, we drive an old Volvo station wagon, and you can ask Kathy why, but she seems to like Volvo station wagons.
Our next question, and this actually is 2 questions, and it reflects something that a lot of readers asked us. A lot of people really were curious about the connection between Elon Musk and Walter Isaacson. That is, not Walter Isaacson, Steve Jobs.
Oh yeah, I was about to say.
And so, let me ask you the 2 of them here. This one, Chris Curley. I'm going to ask him as a twofer. Chris Curley talks about how do you compare Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, and the other question is, in your book on Jobs, you explain how you would sometimes need to deconflict his reality from your other sources. Did you find more difficulty with that in this book on Elon Musk?
First of all, as a biographer, you think each person deserves a biography, and as opposed to mushing it all together. And I think the 3 most consequential people of our day and generation are, or 3 of the most, probably 3 most, in terms of non-political figures, are Steve Jobs for bringing us into the era of friendly personal computers, smartphones, an app economy, 1,000 songs in our pocket. Jennifer Doudna to bring us into the era where we can edit our own genes and rewrite our own DNA, and those of our children, or those of future children. And then thirdly, Musk, who, leave aside all of his flaws in terms of Twitter, brought us into the era of electric vehicles almost single-handedly, something else we didn't talk about, but I don't know it would have happened had it just been the old team there or whatever. Everybody else went bankrupt. Tesla went bankrupt in 2008, but even so, he was writing checks from his personal checking account, and he brought us into the era of electric vehicles more than any other person on the planet. And he brought us into the era of space, adventure, travel, and commercialization more than anybody else on this planet. And will do so with AI and with robotics. So I think he's the most consequential person in terms of being part of that pantheon. Jobs and Musk both have reality distortion fields, which means that if you try hard enough, you push people to do things that they think are impossible, that drive them nuts, but they end up being able to do them. And they're able to sometimes overpromise, but they turn the impossible into the merely late. In other words, the rockets do get into orbit and they land upright and they're being reused. You can just drive to Vandenberg and watch one Friday night when it's happening. It's awesome. I think that Jobs had a more spiritual, Jobs was also, could be a jerk at times, and believed that a lack of empathy was sort of a bad personal trait, but it was good at pursuing an enterprise. He would say to me, a person like yourself has so much empathy, but it's almost egotistical. You want people to like you. You just care that everybody in front of you likes you, which means you're always talking sweetly and wearing a velvet glove, and you don't get blank done, shit done. I think Musk believes that too, which is it's fine and good and sweet and sometimes self-indulgent to be so empathetic that you just want everybody around you to like you. But you got to be a little bit tough if you're going to get rockets into orbit or create the world's most valuable digital company that way. I think that, though, Jobs had a better spiritual feel for human emotions. He's what he called what makes our hearts sing. It's why the iPod is such a beautiful thing. Musk has a deeper feel for manufacturing, engineering, for actually making the product and making them in America and figuring out factories that will do it, which is an underappreciated talent, I think, in this day and age, because our country quit figuring out it could make products. He has a better sense of how to resist regulation and referees, which makes him seem like a bad person. But we used to be a nation of risk takers, and now we have more referees and regulators than we have risk takers. So I think he's getting that balance right.
Which of your books are you most proud of writing?
Well, in some ways, Musk was the most difficult because it was right, and it is the most intense because he's the most intense. And it was certainly harder and then more thrilling to be able to actually get the stories on the page. I mean, I love Ben Franklin, but that was easy in a way. We read all of his letters, his journals, people say about him, and you have a genial guy flying a kite in the rain and saying a penny saved is a penny earned. If you judge it the way the Olympics do by what was the degree of difficulty, I took a risk doing this. I was thinking of doing something that would have been much easier, a more historical character. It's like, all right, I kind of admire the fact that Musk is a risk taker, and this is, by the way, before he bought Twitter. I want to take a career and personal and just lifestyle risk and do something that I don't think others could do as easily, meaning just be there all the time. And it's not so much that I'm most proud of it, but it's the one that I found I had to push myself the hardest to get it right.
Thank you, Walter Isaacson and Anita Chabre.
Thank you, Anita.
And thank you to all of our book club readers for joining us today. This is our first event in El Segundo. Have a good evening, everyone.